That sounds like, no, not quite. Should be? Oh yes, so it is. Good afternoon, and welcome once again to Music is Sanctuary. We have 3 more concerts before the conclusion of our first term, and I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Carson Becke, to the recital series this afternoon. Carson has organized just a fantastic program of works centered around, well, I wouldn't say centered around, but strongly featuring the music of the Finnish composer Sibelius, the great symphonist and composer of other works, and even with an Ottawa connection with a piece by Robert Fleming, a great Ottawa composer of church music in large measure, but also chamber music, symphonic music, and keyboard music. He didn't live a long life, but he is a person who's made an enormous contribution to musical culture in Canada. So I'm so pleased to see some of Robert Fleming's music on the program. Also, Carson has adapted parts of the opera Tosca by Puccini, thus the Memories of Tosca theme that we chose for this show, and Carson's going to speak a little bit about that. And I'll leave further program notes and embellishments to him. Our series continues with 2 more weeks. Next week, I'm going to play the 9 meditations on the Nativity by Olivier Messiaen called La Nativité du Seigneur. I'm playing 5 concerts of that work here, there, and everywhere. The first of them will be next Tuesday at this time, so commend that to you. And on the 20th of December, our final concert of our first term will be featuring the wonderful harpist Caroline Leonardelli. She now divides her time between Ottawa and France, so we've been able to nab her for a couple of those weeks that she's actually in Ottawa, and she'll be playing for us on the 20th before we resume on January 10th after a short break. Our soup today is Italian Wedding, and our guest chef is Diana Hampson. As always, we commend that hospitality to you, and you are free to join us for the soup in the curry room through this exit door. Hang a right down the hallway and just follow the splendid odors of whatever is being concocted down there, but this one is going to be a beautiful soup, and I know you'll want to share in it. So without any further delay, I am very, very privileged, pleased, and honored to welcome Dr. Carson Becke. Please make him welcome.
Oh, there we go. Wow. Okay, here we go, great. So like I said, none of these composers are particularly well known as composers for the piano, and that's sort of what fascinates me about them. I find that on the piano we always get kind of drawn into the same list of about 10 composers, but there's so much music for this instrument written by others who thought about the instrument in different ways, and in some ways kind of strangely creative ways, and Sibelius is one of those. There is a bit of an origin story for this program. I was asked to play a recital a few weeks ago at the residence of the Finnish ambassador in celebration of the 75th anniversary of Canadian-Finnish diplomatic relations. And he said, can you please play a program of Finnish and Canadian piano music, which is not something that I have in my usual arsenal of repertoire. So I did some digging, and of course, my mind went immediately to Sibelius because he is kind of the great Finnish composer, but I didn't really know any of his piano music, and I discovered a few pieces that I will now be playing as much as possible because I really love them. I'm also going to play a piece by a Finnish composer named Ari Merikanto, who's a composer I was completely unfamiliar with, and I'm very happy to now be acquainted with. So that was the Finnish side. And then for the Canadian side, I'm going to start with a piece by Robert Fleming, who, as Matthew mentioned, spent much of his life here in Ottawa. He was born in Saskatchewan, but moved to Ottawa to become the resident composer for the National Film Board, and I believe he was also the organist at St. Matthew's Church? St. Martin's Church. I have a bit of a personal connection to this piece, which is his sonatina for piano. My great-grandmother, Mary Mackey, was a piano teacher in Ottawa for a long time. She died in 2019 at the age of 104. So for the better part of the 20th century, she was teaching piano here, and she was my first teacher. And when she passed away, I was very fortunate to inherit the piano that she taught on for all those years, and is now the piano that I practice on every day. And she and Robert Fleming were quite good friends, and he would often come over to her house for these little concert evenings that she would host. And so I know that he played this sonatina on the piano that I now practice on a daily basis. So I feel like there's a nice little connection between the two of us through that instrument. So I'm going to play the first movement for you, the first movement of Robert Fleming's sonatina for piano. So here we go. Okay, so I'll continue now with a few pieces by Jean Sibelius, beginning the Finnish portion of today's program. So I'm going to play a set of 3 pieces entitled Kilikki. Kilikki is a character, a female character from what is considered to be the sort of Finnish national epic called the Kalevala. Kalevala. I find it so difficult to say that. At the concert at the embassy, I said it once, failed, turned to the ambassador, and he stood up and said it for me, which was really nice of him. So the Kalevala is a collection of poetry compiled in the 19th century that really kind of speaks to the roots of Finnish nationalism. The Scandinavian countries for a long time were in flux. There were different countries in charge. Boundaries were constantly changing, and they felt constantly subjugated by people that they didn't feel had any right to subjugate them. And Finland was no exception to this. And in the 19th century, there was a strong movement to define Finland as a truly independent country. And they started from roots of culture. They wanted to say, look, we are different. We have these stories that are our stories and not yours. And the Kalevala was kind of the root of that. And it was a great inspiration for Sibelius throughout his life. He wrote a lot of music based on stories from these poems. These pieces are just entitled Kilikki, which we know was a character from the Kalevala, but he doesn't really give any information past that, which is sort of typical of him. He suggests something and then leaves it to you as the listeners to fill in all the blanks. So there are 3 pieces. To me, I feel a connection to Sibelius' music because it's totally elemental, and I think that's something that, as Canadians, living through the winters that we live through, about to have another one begin, connection to the elements is something that I think we feel very strongly. So 2 of these pieces, to me, are really just about nature. I always play them in different orders, too, because I'm not actually convinced by his original order. So I guess for today, it will be the 2nd and 3rd pieces that I'll play, to me, are really pieces about the kind of great expanse of the landscape. The 2nd piece, it gives me this feeling that you get right before a storm, where things are totally calm, and there's this sort of like pent-up energy that's underneath the surface, but doesn't quite come out. And then the last movement is, the storm or some kind of major weather event. The first piece is really a piece about Kilikki. It's a character piece in the kind of true sense of the word. I don't know much about what she was like, but from this piece I gather that she was probably quite capricious, probably had a change of heart every 5 seconds or so. The piece kind of goes in lots of different directions. And it's a wonderful little piece for piano. So here are the 3 pieces from Kilikki by Sibelius. Thank you. So you see what I mean about kind of elemental, especially the last two. Okay, so continuing with Sibelius, this is a much better known piece that I'm about to play. This is his Valse Triste, which I was wondering why I knew this piece so well. And the Finnish ambassador educated me. He said the reason this piece is so famous was that I can't remember which Olympics it was, one of the Olympics in the 90s, the Finnish figure skating, the ice dance team that I think either came second or won a gold medal, danced to this music, and it was considered this kind of great moment where Sibelius became sort of seen in pop culture, and everybody was so kind of taken by the music as well as the ice dance. So I didn't know that until quite recently, but this is just really a wonderful, wonderful piece, originally for full orchestra and arranged here by Sibelius for solo piano. Anybody who has interacted with Finnish culture will know sort of two things about it. The first thing being that it's not a particularly upbeat place. There's a lot of sort of things that are not all that happy about their traditional folklore, and it's a very dark place, long winters, very long nights. And sort of as a result of that, they also have quite a dark sense of humor. So everything is sort of about death in a way that is often kind of taken lightly, which I think is sort of a great combination of things. Sort of somber culture with a good sense of humor is something that I appreciate very much. So this piece, unsurprisingly, is also about death. It's actually incidental music to a play that is called Death. So really, it's sort of everywhere here. And the story, which I'll tell you because it really changes how you hear the piece, I think. It's written in a very kind of descriptive way. Is there's an old woman lying on her bed and her son is beside her, comforting her, and he knows that these are her last moments. And so she's lying there, and he's talking to her, and then she says, I hear music in the distance. I hear something faint far away. I hear music that sounds like a waltz. And so you'll hear that. There's a moment where very quiet, well, I will try and play it very quietly, this sort of beautiful waltz melody comes out of nowhere from very far away. And he says, no, that's not real, come back to earth. And then so the waltz stops. And then she says, no, again, I can hear the music. And he tries to stop her, but this time she won't let him calm her down. And so she gets up and begins dancing with some kind of phantom figure that he can't see, but she obviously can. And this dance kind of gets more and more intense. And then there's kind of a breaking point where everything just goes dead quiet, and she falls back onto the bed, and the specter of death is standing at the doorway. And that's the end of the piece. So it's delightful. So here is the Valse Triste by Sibelius. Thank you very much. I just adore that piece. I think that's one of the most beautiful pieces. Okay, so now to conclude the Finnish portion of this program, this is a short piece by a composer named Ari Merikanto, who I mentioned I had never heard of before until I came across, or until I was asked to sort of do some digging on Finnish music, and I'm so glad that I found this guy. He lived from the late 19th century until the middle of the 50s, 1958, I believe, and he was the director of the conservatory in Helsinki. So he was a musician, he was a teacher, he composed, but he wasn't widely regarded as a great composer, but nonetheless composed throughout his life, and wrote quite a lot of music for the piano. So this is just a very short piece by Merikanto called Moonlight. And I was totally struck by it when I found it, because so I live out in the countryside. I live close to Wakefield on a small lake called Pike Lake. I'm lucky to be surrounded by these beautiful tree-covered hills. And one of my kind of favorite things is in the middle of the winter when it's totally snow-covered, it's dead silent late at night, and it's a full moon. You can go outside and you don't need a flashlight. You can see everything. You can see a shadow because there's just so much light generated by the moon. And this piece to me just captures that moment and that feeling perfectly. So here is Moonlight by Ari Merikanto. Okay, so we've had a few sleepy pieces now, and I think it's time to change that. And also, so concludes the Finnish portion of today's recital. So to finish now, that's a good pun, actually. I didn't think about that in advance, but that's great. So to finish this recital with something that is not Finnish, this is my own, I call it Fantasy on Themes from Act 1 of Puccini's Tosca. So Tosca is one of my absolute favorite operas. I was very lucky to do all of my studies in the UK. I was a student at the Royal Academy of Music in London for a few years, and then at Oxford University. And while I forget many of the things that I was taught at the Royal Academy, what I will never forget is living in London and being able to go to the Royal Opera House pretty much all the time. They had student tickets that I could get for £5 per show, and I took advantage of that. I was there at least twice a week for the 4 years that I was a student, and I think I probably saw every opera you could hope to see. And every time Tosca came up, which was a lot, they programmed it at least once every two seasons, I went multiple times to see it because I could never get enough of the music in that opera. And as a pianist, we can do a lot of things and we engage with a lot of different kinds of music, but the one thing that we really can't do is play opera. We can rehearse opera. We often play with singers as repetiteurs so that they can learn the opera. But that's sort of different than performing it. And maybe I'm just being greedy here because I can perform so much at the piano, but that's something that bothers me. I want to be able to perform opera. Thankfully, there is this great tradition of pianists creating paraphrases or fantasies on themes from operas, going back all the way to the 18th century. This was something that performers did frequently. And in a way, Wagner comes to mind here. It was done almost as a way of giving an audience a preview or like a teaser for what the opera might be like. So in the example of Tristan und Isolde, one of Wagner's great operas, the final scene, the Isolde's Liebestod, was heard long before the opera was ever premiered, so that people could kind of listen to it and think, oh wow, that's going to be great. What they didn't tell them was that Liebestod is 7 minutes and the opera is 6 hours. So you really had to, just as soon as they got you in the doors of the theater, they just locked them and kept you there for 6 hours. Obviously, Tosca was written long before my paraphrase, but I sort of like that tradition of condensing an act of an opera into sort of the highlights, if you were. I mean, I think the whole thing is a highlight, but I tried to create a bit of a synthesis of this act so that you could get a sense of what the music was like in a short period of time without sitting through the whole hour and 15 minutes that it lasts for. I'm not going to do a synopsis of the opera for you now, but I will just set the scene a little bit. And actually, it's appropriate that we're in a church, because the entire first act of Tosca is set in a church. There is a painter, a man named Mario Cavaradossi, who is painting a new portrait of the Virgin Mary at the back of the church, and his lover is the singer Floria Tosca, who is coming into the church and is jealous because the woman that he's painting looks nothing like her and looks suspiciously like a blonde woman that's been coming to services frequently that she's noticed. So she's jealous, and at the same time there's a fugitive hiding in the church. So I mean, maybe you can imagine that there's a fugitive behind that Christmas tree that Cavaradossi is helping support. He's an enemy of the Italian Republic. You just have to kind of go with the history here. And the chief of police is this horrible guy named Scarpia, who is looking for this fugitive and has reason to believe that Cavaradossi might be helping him. He's also in love with Tosca. So Scarpia comes in, he notices that Tosca is jealous, and he figures that he can use Tosca's jealousy to get at the fugitive, but maybe also get at Tosca. So Scarpia sort of has a master plan that is hatched here. A little bit like Wagner or one of my favorite movies, Star Wars, there are sort of like musical indicators of characters that Puccini uses to tell you when certain characters are coming on to the set. So the music you hear at the very beginning is kind of an angry sounding set of chords. That is the music for Scarpia. So every time you hear that, that's when Scarpia is kind of around doing bad things. And you'll notice that towards the end of this paraphrase, at the end of this movement, that music is everywhere, which reflects what happens in the opera. At the end of the act, Scarpia is on stage. It's one of the most incredible operatic scenes. He's standing there in this church as a choir is coming down the aisle, about to sing a Te Deum to the glory of God. And Scarpia is standing there kind of realizing that he's on the cusp of victory. He's going to manage to find this fugitive, kill him. He's going to take Floria Tosca home, do what he wants to do to her, and he's kind of glorying in his evilness, I guess. And at the climax of the final scene, the choir is singing the Te Deum. There's an organ playing. There are bells ringing. I'm trying to capture all of that here, so if it's loud, that's why. And at the kind of climactic moment, Scarpia says, "Tosca, you make me forget God." And it's so powerful. And that was kind of the reason that I started writing this paraphrase. And then the pandemic happened, and I suddenly had all this time on my hands. So I decided to really get into it and write this piece. So I did not enjoy the kind of dark days of the lockdowns, but I will always be grateful that they gave me time to do something like this. So here is my fantasy on themes from Act 1 of Tosca. Thank you very much. Thank you so much to all of you for coming this afternoon. Come back next week, 12:10, next Tuesday for Matthew. If you're staying for soup and if you'd like to chat, I'll be there. I also have some CDs for sale. Nothing that I played today, but all music by Richard Strauss. There's a CD of solo piano music by Strauss and a CD of Lieder for voice and piano. I'm singing or playing with the soprano Wallace Junta, also from Ottawa. So those CDs are available there. It's 1 for 20 or 2 for 30. So again, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the concert today. Thank you.